Let me now introduce the moderator for today's panel. Nicole Stott is an engineer and a NASA astronaut. She served as flight engineer on ISS Expedition 20 and Expedition 21 and was a mission specialist on STS-128. In 2011, she flew a second time as a mission specialist on STS-133. And I noted, Nicole, that you're also an artist, and you'll need to be an artist this afternoon, given the time period. So I'll turn it over to you, okay?
All right, thank you very much. Well, it's really nice to be here this afternoon, and thankfully I can still say afternoon versus evening. We haven't ruled there quite yet. One of the good things about me standing up here is this will be our final panel for the 2 days. But I'd also say that that's kind of a downside of it as well. I think these last 2 days have been filled with really interesting discussions like this symposium always has for us about the risks and the challenges and the opportunities that we have out there ahead of us. And I think when we come together as groups like this, we stand a much better chance of resolving those kinds of things and taking on those challenges and opportunities and doing really great stuff for our future. I'm going to throw out an analog definition that's a little bit simpler than the one we just heard, and that goes something like, the definition is doing something similar or comparable. And what I would argue is that that does sound like a very simple definition in contrast to what we just heard. And I think this panel would agree that what we do with analogs, if they're done well, is not simple. It borders, I would say, to some degree, to the same kind of complexity that we have with our spaceflight missions themselves. Today we'll discuss analog missions from the standpoint of improving our space mission experience. From a crew member standpoint, I have to say it's really sad that we're not able to just fly in space to learn how to live and work and fly in space. So these analogs are very significant. There's a really significance to the use of them. And also, since the majority of a crew member's time on the ground preparing for a mission is spent training, we want this training to be as effective as possible in order to best simulate the space environment that we'll be in. The beauty, I think, of a good analog mission is that it is a legitimate mission in its own right. The scientific and technical goals of the mission are meaningful. The mission environment is a real analogous extreme environment. And the crew is of an international mix similar to what we have on our space missions. And that the mission supports a dynamic where the crew members can be challenged to better understand their own strengths and limitations, and also how to manage these differences across the crew to support mission success. As an astronaut in training, we participate in many different types of analog missions, expeditionary training, team building kinds of activities. As a personal example, for me, I would have to say, based on the analog experience that I've had, the single best preparation that I had for what it would be like to live and work on the space station was a NEMO mission. We were a crew of 6. We had an international mix in our crew. We spent 18 days living and working on the undersea Aquarius habitat, and we were performing very legitimate scientific activities that were in direct support of NASA's strategic goals at the time. So primarily focused on surface exploration and remote telemedicine types capabilities. The environment that we have at Aquarius at the time, and perhaps even now, was the closest thing that we have to living and working on ISS. And I would argue that there's something to be said for an analog mission, especially from a psychological standpoint, that it doesn't provide you with the opportunity to just jump in your minivan and drive away if things aren't going well. And which is also a key aspect to what living and working in a space is like, and also for the future of our space exploration type missions. I'd really like to quickly introduce our panel members. We have had a couple changes, and sadly some people were not able to hang on for the panel this afternoon. I think, like the education panel, we have a really nice mix of experiences and perspectives on the panel. We have panelists that have participated themselves in analog missions or remote expeditions. We have panelists that have designed and implemented analog missions for other crew members. We have those that have developed the tools to measure the impacts of the mission, such as stress and fatigue on crew members. And we have panelists that have developed countermeasures to deal with both the analog and actual space mission environment. After the introductions, what I'd like to do, since we are kind of running short on time, is have each panelist give us a 2 to 3 minute just presentation of their own perspective and experience with respect to analogs and their value really to improving the future and how we can better use them for improving the future of our space exploration type missions. So I'll start right here to my right. We have Jay Buckey, and I'm going to pull up my little cheat sheet here. All right, so Jay Buckey, physician and engineer. As a retired astronaut, he was a payload specialist on the STS-90 Neurolab mission. He's on the faculty at Dartmouth and a continuing spaceflight investigator and is working on development of state-of-the-art, if I understand correctly, VR technology, virtual reality technology for astronaut psychological support that will be tested during a high seas analog mission. And he's also the author of a book called Space Physiology. Thank you for being here, Jay. All right, Rupert Guzar. And some of these folks we have met before through our earlier panels. Rupert is also a physician. He's active in the international space medicine community, director of the Institute of Aerospace Medicine at the DLR German Space Center, and has been a major force behind the new, and I apologize if I pronounce this incorrectly, but I believe NVHAB facility in Cologne, where based on earlier conversations today, I think some very wonderful things will probably happen there as we move forward in the future. Let's see, Vadim Agustin. We've met Vadim before. He is a psychologist from the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow. He is a world authority on psychological factors associated with spaceflight and one of the guiding fathers of the Mars 520 program. To his right, I have to apologize. Sir, would you mind introducing yourself? I don't have you on my list of panelists, but we welcome you to the team.
Okay, thank you. I'm Jeanne Lien. I'm working as a lead scientist at Institute for Biomedical Problems, and I'm working in field of space medicine and physiology since 1951. So I have experience almost 54 years of working over this field of knowledge. And during my career, I trained as a cosmonaut for space flight. The boat was hot. And after this program was canceled, I went to Antarctica and spent some biomedical research at Vostok Antarctic Station, and I will talk about it more later.
Awesome. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us as well.
May I add about Evgeny? Evgeny was an inventor, and he was a chef of our Bion program, right from the very beginning of program Bion. And right from the very, he was young, and the program of Bion was just newborn. A newborn due to him, because he was that man who did this program and led this program from 70 to 98. So all the, on this program, we had like scientists from 40 University of States, from France, from Europe, and so on. And Evgeny was head of all this gang.
Yes. Thank you, Inessa. and thank you, Inessa, for joining us on this panel. We've also met Inessa before. She is also with the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow. She is a world authority on countermeasures for weightlessness and neurosensory factors associated with spaceflight. And as we've heard in these past few days, I have so much more as well. Let's see. To the right of Inessa, we have Louise Plaut-Snyder. Lori. Lori is an exercise physiologist at the Johnson Space Center. Sorry, Lori. She's an expert in physical countermeasures for weightlessness and a principal investigator on the Sprint intensive exercise protocol, which I believe is still in work on the ISS with crew members today. And Rachel Seidler. Rachel Seidler is also a researcher. She's from the University of Michigan. She serves as the lead for the NSBRI Sensory Motor Adaptation Integration Science Team. And that includes, I believe, some bed rest studies either in your past or currently as well. So a very interesting panel with some very interesting backgrounds, I believe, in the area of analogs from all different perspectives. And I'd like to start here to my right, Jay, with you, if you could share some of your experience for us as well.
Certainly, yes. And thank you, Nicole. Thank you for the introductions, and it's fun to be here on this panel. I was going to focus on analogs that I've actually worked with, so that doesn't mean it's all the analogs that are, but just the ones that I know something about. And also the title is Cooperative Use of Analogs, so I was going to talk about the analog and then how it's used cooperatively, at least in my experience. And I'll try to stay at 3 minutes. All right. So the one analog that I've been involved with is head-down tilt. And I guess the most obvious thing to say about analogs is that it really depends on what you want to study. So there are different analogs for different things, and it's really important to choose the right analog. Head-down tilt, really good for things like bone, muscle, some of the cardiovascular effects. If you take somebody, put them at head-down tilt for a period of time and stand them up, the effects are just like what somebody looks like when they come back from being in space in terms of blood pressure control. So it's a very nice analog for those things. And I first learned about international collaboration in head-down tilt from a head-down tilt study at the DLR back in 1988, HDT 88, which was an excellent study that really showed me how international collaboration was done. It was a team from several different countries. Everybody had a role to play. The data were shared. The results were published in a focused journal article. It was really nicely done. So when a head-down tilt study is done well, you can really get a lot out of it by putting that investment and getting a group of subjects together and then bringing in the right teams. But as I said, head-down tilt is not good for all things. And for example, if you were to measure central venous pressure in head-down tilt, it wouldn't match what you'd see in flight. And that's probably true for a lot of the VIP findings as well. Probably the pressure changes you would see in head-down tilt don't really match what you would see in space. And that's why other analogs like microgravity flights are particularly important. And I'd like to put in a plug for continuing the microgravity flight program here at Johnson Space Center for a time that was at risk. And it's really a critical resource. And even with short-term microgravity flights, you can make measurements like central venous pressure or intraocular pressure that do match what happens in microgravity and allow you to answer some specific questions. So microgravity itself, using parabolic flight, is a great analog. And from a cooperative point of view, it's almost always done as a campaign, as a flight campaign, where a week is dedicated to a series of flights, and then investigators are brought in to try to use the resource collaboratively. Also, there's a wrong way to use analogs, which I found out the hard way in the NEMO project. As a matter of fact, we had a project had to do with hearing assessment. Acoustic waves travel through the air. The density of the air is a lot greater when you're in NEMO, and that kind of messes up your hearing measurements, which, as I say it to you right now, wouldn't that seem obvious? Well, it wasn't obvious to us at the outset, and so that experiment didn't go very well. And just a little cautionary note about making sure you choose the right analog. Another analog that we're involved with is high Cs. And high Cs is particularly good for the psychological aspects of space flight, where you're always trying to look for an analog to look at things like team building, stress, depression, those sort of things. And it's hard to find a good analog for that. Clinical populations are really not good analogs for what happens in space. And you want to have something that has an element of isolation and confinement that at least has some similarity to space flight. High Cs is taking place in a habitat on Mauna Loa, and it's a crew of 6. They've spent 9 months in the habitat, and they're coming out next week. And so it will be very interesting to hear about their experiences next week when they come out. And that's also been done collaboratively with several investigators' teams participating in the high seas habitat. And I guess the last analog I want to talk about, which is not, I guess, what we'd classically think about as an analog, but it's numerical modeling, maybe an analog in electrons. And that's an analog we're using for some of the VIP work, where to really understand what's happening with the VIP syndrome, you're looking at multiple things that are all changing at the same time. You're having pressures in the head and pressures in the eye and hydrostatic forces that are being removed, the weight of tissues that are changing. And to look at that in an integrated way, it's really hard to do that just thinking about it off the top of your head. And so the numerical modeling approach really offers a good way to do that, with the pitfalls that that's something that also perhaps needs to be standardized in the community so that people have some sort of a agreed approach to how certain things are going to be modeled. Because classically, most models that are used for most terrestrial things don't include things like hydrostatic gradients often, or they won't include the effects of tissue weight, because that's not something you usually worry about. So I guess that's what I had to say about
Look at you.
analogs. Did I stay on? I hope I stayed on 3 minutes. Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you for the thumbs up on the microgravity flights. I
Oh,
think
very
that's,
critical.
I think that's important not only from what we just discussed here, but also for the panel that we just finished up with for education. I think the value that goes along with involving students on their real projects in an environment like that, I think will lead very nicely to applied research and those kinds of things in their later lives as well.
Can I tell a story there too? So there has been this educational program where student teams from universities can fly microgravity flights. So we had a team from Dartmouth. It was an all-female team to put together a flight project. They flew, and now the one member of that team I hear from periodically because she's working on the Mars program at JPL. So somebody who got inspired in college, flew on those flights, and has gone on and has made a career, a pretty interesting career in space.
And thanks. And thank you also for pointing out the cooperative nature of this, that standpoint of the analogs, but also that when we look at analogs, we're not just talking about something that I described, which is a full up, expeditionary type mission, but it can be something as pointed as a particular area of study that needs to be looked at, and we just can't be in the same environment that we're really trying to study. Can't fly in space to learn to fly in space, so I thank you for that as well. Okay, and Rupert, thank you.
Yeah, when we speak about analogs, we can speak about methods, about facilities, or about locations. So what I would like to use the time I have is to speak a little bit about our philosophy and explain the Envy Hub word. So when we had the opportunity in Germany to think about an analog facility, we knew and know there are fascinating analog facilities all over the world that should be used internationally. So the question was how to design a facility which might be needed, which would complement to the international work and where we could internationally collaborate. And being European, we thought, okay, analog is for a Mars flight or a moon station or something, but when you go deeper into it and start to build a moon station or Mars station, you quickly find out in 5 years it will be old-fashioned, and in 30 or 50 years when the Mars or moon station will be built, everybody will shake his head. So we thought, okay, why make a mission analog? Why not make a scientific analog? Nobody has, maybe some people have, but a scientific analog where we say, okay, what in life sciences is needed to have successful flights to Moon or to Mars or Moon Station, Mars Station? What is needed, and at the same time, what could be of benefit for Earth at the same time? So we said we should focus on those aspects, and the first aspect is science. What is needed is there a real space station analog? Because we have the space station to prepare right now. Is there a good space station analog? And we said, okay, we need have a lot of questions about bed rest studies, so we need a nice bed rest facility. But in bed rest, one has to look into the human body with an MRI, and also for specific questions with a PET possibility. Who has a PET facility, an MRI facility directly next to a bed rest station? And nobody, all over the world, nothing. I was very surprised. And then a facility for psychological research for stressful situations, very close to it. A nice physiology facility, a nice human short-arm centrifuge for artificial gravity. So that's what we were focusing on. And we asked ourselves, who has a facility for high carbon dioxide? Because the station has a high carbon dioxide, and who has a facility where we could study the future exploration atmosphere next to the MRI, next to all those things. And that's all what we put together, and that's one scientific analog which I hope, and I'm already very happy, will be used internationally in the future. But then we had also to think about the German taxpayer and the public, and so we said, okay, such a facility should be visible to the community, and therefore about 1/3 of this facility is there to have meetings or to have a nice dinner in a fancy location which no hotel can bring you, because it's authentic space. And so after we open it, we have it, at least it's now very often used for even for rich people having their dinner. Deutsche Bank is inviting their prime customers and say, okay, now we go to those space people and have a nice dinner. And or the Carnival in Cologne said, well, our press conference of the start of the Cologne Carnival will be in Envihab, and that's what they did. So suddenly DLR is on the map, and we have a lot of politicians coming, and so we are not only using an analog facility for research and for international research, but also we like to have some fun in it ourselves. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I like what you said about the public aspect of it as well. And from the standpoint of benefiting all of us here on Earth too, not just for dinners, but from the research that will come from it. And from the dinner standpoint, though, I think there's really something to be said for using facilities like this, and it's what we were talking about from the communication standpoint, to reach out to audiences, to people that might not otherwise know about what's going on with our space program. So thank you. All right, Vadim.
Thank you for the idea, Rupert. Now I know how to use our simulator. If I want to change the administration of the Russian space agency, I will invite them for dinner and change CO2, for example. Let's come to the serious point of view. And what I want to say about analogs. Of course, you all know what analogs are and how they're used and what for. But the idea is where to find the new ideas, how to use analogs, and what analogs can give us in comparison, for example, with ISS. And a very simple example, today Koichi Wakata told us a lot about the autonomy, how to use autonomy, and why not to make autonomy on the ISS. And of course, my colleagues who knew why it's not possible immediately argued about that. But my point is very straightforward. But it's impossible to arrange that autonomy on ISS, but it's possible to switch off communication channel for a period in the chamber study. Why not to make that autonomy and see if the crew will do their job more effectively and how they rearrange the daily schedule, and see this as the simulation of the real autonomous flight. Second idea, which came from today's discussion, actually from yesterday's discussion, was Charlie Baldwin's idea. Why not to use the chambers after the flight? Not maybe to send the crew member immediately into space, but to bring him after the flight not to the hospital, but again to the chambers and do the research and allow him to do operations and field tests, but under the perfect control, like in the ENVI hub in Germany, when you control all the parameters. Now, when they landed, not all the parameters are controlled, and you do the research when he's having different food, contacting different people, and the stress level is not comparable, and many other factors. So, after a week after landing, you can say that all the results are uncomparable, and it's difficult to see what is going on in reality. Is it the result of the space flight or of that week after landing itself? But if you put the subject after the flight into the chambers, it's all controlled, from food to daily schedule and all the parameters of environment. Moreover, if we think about the whole idea, whole concept of going back and forth, we can make isolation study with combination with head-down tilt. So we'll have chamber and microgravity. Then we can have a period of comparative rehabilitation, and then once again repeat head-down tilt and isolation. Who tried this? Nobody, but I think it's practical. And it's much easier than to do the flights twice and under the resistance of the astronaut corps. Finally, the idea of Dr. Gerser that, of course, we are not capable to simulate the real life or the real moon station or the real Mars station, but we have virtual reality technologies now. We can place subjects into the virtual reality in the chambers and see how they're doing operations. And we can simulate off-nominal situation when it's all safe. So we can see how subject can work under the off-nominal unexpected situation like we had today. It was very vivid, that discussion about EVA, when people have no image of what they are going to be in the EVA. Virtual reality allows us to reproduce a lot of things from that point, and even the perception of the situation which doesn't exist in reality but is very probable. So again, as for me, speaking about analogs, now we have to find the new ideas to use which are not possibly can be done in real space flight due to ethical reasons, due to reasons of lack of some technique and logistic, but very practical from the point of view to imagine ourselves how to do operations in the absolutely new kind of missions, interplanetary missions. And finally, again, I want to stress the role of analogs for team building among not only astronauts but scientists. How to make the good research team, I mean the international research team, to place these people into the analog study and see if they can interact, if they can exchange with data, if they can do the research together. And you will make a good research team for the real space flight. That's exactly what I want to say in 3 minutes. I hope it's good enough.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think any crew members here would really like the idea of having a virtual reality type place. I don't know what comes to mind to me is holodeck from Star Trek, but you know, really to be able to be immersed like that in a way that you know there's really no harm that could come to you, but you could learn I think, in a very efficient and effective way about the operations you'll experience in some other environment. I don't know about the coming back to a chamber thing, how that would go over. But I think it's worth considering, because I think we all understand that there are there are not the controls in place that can perhaps be providing us with the best data to follow up with the research that we've done on orbit as well. And if we can find some way to make sure that we're getting the best information, as we follow up from the flight, then we should look at those things as well. All right. Yes, sir. Evgeny.
Many of you know that IBMP was created at the end of 1963. Therefore, we didn't really have proper research facilities. We had to start from ground zero, so to say. However, we already had a handful of spaceflight issues that we needed to tackle. And at that time in the Soviet Union, we started working on long-term space stations. At that time, our institute was tasked with developing a system and methodologies and recommendations on medical support of the upcoming future missions. And that led to a lot of questions. What experiments should be conducted? What conditions should we create for those experiments? And our management came to good, wise conclusions. We should use natural conditions of central Antarctica. And starting with 1966, for the next 5 years, the Institute sent its specialists to do research in Antarctica. They had a chance to live and work shoulder to shoulder with the polar researchers. And we, meanwhile, looked into adaptation processes, countermeasures, and so forth. So I wanted to tell you about Vostok Station in Antarctica. It's located on the ice cupola. Oxygen pressure is 90 millimeters mercury, so it's almost hypoxic condition. It's the southern geomagnetic pole, extreme temperatures, and this means that we have to deal with irregular periodicity of night and day, so hypoxia, geomagnetic storms, extreme cold temperatures, and the monotony of day-to-day life of the researchers on this polar station or polar base. And because the temperatures were so low, the majority of the time, polar men or researchers would spend inside the station. That meant that for the whole year, people were experiencing hypokinesia because the station was very limited in space. Their ability to move around was limited, which is very similar to what we have on the station. Maybe countermeasure people will disagree with me because they have exercise protocols that are pretty intense in terms of the amount of hours dedicated to physical activities. But nevertheless, there were certain characteristics that were similar to space flight, and there were a lot of risk factors which made this station very convenient for biomedical experiments. The difference in autonomy that the subject experienced here and the subjects in a chamber, for example, is as follows. If within 10 months of the experiment something happens, there is some kind of an emergency, nobody could come and rescue you. Because of the low temperatures, the airplanes cannot fly to that polar station. So basically, you can die there. Nobody's going to come and help you. And when a person is in the isolation chamber, they know that if something happens to them or something happens to the experiment, the chamber will be opened up and they will be extracted and they would be able to get help. And that's a very important psychological factor, because a person who is on board the station understands that if something happens, no one from the outside can help them, which actually adds to the psychological stress of that person, which is another similarity between work on board the space station and work at the polar station. And if we're talking about interplanetary flight, even more so, because you definitely cannot come help those crews when they're halfway across the universe. So in Antarctica, there are several stations or several outposts which are very similar in living conditions. There's a U.S. station, Munson Scott, which is located at the altitude about 100,000 meters. Concordia European Station, which is also located at the altitude about 3.5 kilometers. And probably the most challenging station is Vostok Station. It's located on the higher altitude, and it's considered to be the area of the most extreme temperatures, because temperatures there reach minus 89 degrees in wintertime. So these polar stations, these Antarctic stations or bases, should be utilized to solve issues that can crop up in our future interplanetary flights. We know that the European Space Agency is already utilizing this resource for this purpose. We're not doing that yet, but we are in negotiations. We're talking about returning to the Antarctic to continue our research. I don't know if Edmondson Scott base is used by the U.S. for any kind of spaceflight research. However, I think it's probably the least suitable base for those experiments because the conditions there are way too comfortable. And there are a lot of people who work there. Especially in the summer, we would have up to 200 people there. And in wintertime, about 50 people stay there. But it's a huge facility. You have a lot of people. So it's very comfortable there. You're not going to have the same conditions on the Moon or Mars. Vostok has about 16 people. At Concordia, there are maybe a couple more people. So I think if we unite our efforts in this area, we could design a joint program, a research program, and then we could think about how to best implement it, whether we will implement it separately and then share the results, or whether we will conduct the experiments jointly. However, you have a pretty good setup in terms of natural environment, naturally extreme conditions that we should use. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that based on what you said, it seems like it would be important to take advantage of the lessons we learned there from previous missions, and then also perhaps to consider using that facility for future analogs to space exploration like you suggest. Vanessa.
I'm listening to my colleagues and thinking that the scope of our discussion is huge. The thing is, when we talk about analogs, the only thing they would sometimes have in common is the word analog, because each one of them is simulating different characteristics, different parameters of a space flight. So it's a vast research field, because we have analogs that allow us to study the psychological aspects of long-duration flights, isolation, stress, and so forth. On the other hand, we can have analogs that allow us to study microgravity effects on the human body or other factors, depending on what it is that we're interested in terms of spaceflight. So sometimes it's difficult to unify our efforts because everybody is pursuing their own tasks, their own objectives, and therefore they would have their own analogs. Because I don't know about an analog that would allow us to encompass every aspect of the spaceflight in one facility. This means that all our efforts are very different. What's very important is that even though we have analogs for physiological and psychological effects, we then narrow them down even further. I mean, if it's a physiological analog, I will looking at the cardiovascular system or locomotive function or sensory motor. And you talked about the risk of having incorrectly designed analog. So if we design it incorrectly, if we don't use the analog for the purposes for which it should be used, then we're working with something completely different. It's not useful in terms of our research. A lot of times I look over research results or I edit various programs, and I know that the criteria number one in selecting what will be successful and what won't is the ability to evaluate how adequate is the analog to the purposes of the research. I know that there are a lot of projects that are multiple in numbers, and these are the projects that deal with microgravity. So microgravity analog, where we're studying what's happening in the brain, what's happening to the cognitive function, to the structure, and so forth. So there are a lot of studies in this area due to the fact that we now have more opportunity to do our studies. So, you know, I stated many times before that we're not studying the brain function and the brain structure enough. But the thing is, we didn't have the opportunity to do so. We didn't have the facilities, we didn't have the tools, but now we have a lot of necessary tools. We have MRIs, we have various scans, we have other tools that do not negatively affect our subjects. And once we got these tools, we started the necessary research in Russia, in the US, and other countries. So once we started all this research, we started saying, you know, we need to see how this research will play out in the analog facilities. Because cosmonauts don't want to participate in experiments where they're purely experiment subjects. So they tell me sometimes, well, we're not guinea pigs, right? So they're interested in the experiments where they're not just the object of the study, but they're also the researchers. So I spoke to my Johnson Center colleagues about the results of our research. we were telling my colleague Rachel about the results of the cosmonaut experiments, and she was telling us the results of their bed rest experiments. Bed rest is a proved, well-researched analog that imitates space environment in terms of physiology. You have similar fluid shifts, you have similar unloading, hypokinesia, similar effect on the vestibular function, and so forth. However, when we looked at the results today, Rachel's results, and I was presenting my results, we noticed that there's a difference in our research results. And we started thinking why that's the case. And we realized that when we study brain function, bed rest is not a very good analog, as it turns out. We thought it was, but it's really not. Analog should simulate very specific factors, and we need to make sure that the simulation is done correctly. In order for us to be confident that it's done correctly, we need to test it. We do a lot of work, for example, with inversion. And the more I work with this analog, the more I grow in confidence that immersion model is very good. Immersion allows us to switch off the second gravitational sensory system, as it were, because gravitation has a huge impact on the development of living organisms. All the living creatures had to adjust to gravitation. And one of the systems that allows us to do so is our vestibular system. What is our second system that allows us to do so? It's the system of locomotor afferentation. It's the system that was designed naturally, as it were, by the natural world. And it controls locomotion and postural system.
And that's how we can recreate the movement. This posture system completely depends on the locomotor afferentation. And I think that it is one of the second factor is one of the paramount effects of zero-G and staying in zero-G. And deactivating this system is extremely important. And we know about that. But I want to say that the activator and the regulator that allows you to deactivate this system is the locomotor system. And that is why immersion, within the same time frame, we get results similar to the results in flight. And that allows us to study the mechanisms of what we see and develop various countermeasures, and not only to develop them, but also to test them within the framework of the immersion system. Of course, this analog is not going to be universal. Don't think that it's going to be the silver bullet, because we work within very short framework of 7 to 12 days. We have them for 7 to 12 days, but it is enough to create very acute responses in the body, because that's when we get rid of the gravitational stimulus and we can activate the compensation mechanism in the body. It allows people within 2 or 3 weeks to adapt to the point that when cosmonauts and astronauts come back to Earth, they have to get used to the gravitation back again. So how can you recreate this acute effect on the body? Well, thanks to the immersion system. However, if we want to study something long-term, immersion is not going to be the panacea. So, what I'm trying to say here, analogs are very important. I actually created a schematic how our knowledge and understanding of what is happening in zero-G is dependent on our analogs. And we have to understand that this system is rather limited. We study cosmonauts, so the information that we're getting comes from the cosmonauts. They notice something and they tell us, but we should not just limit ourselves to the study of cosmonauts, because it would take us like 15 years to accumulate the number of subjects. That's why we have to create an analog and test it on volunteers or maybe on animals and try and figure out what is the mechanism for this or that phenomena. And when we are done with the analog and with the study, we can suggest certain countermeasures that would allow to get rid of or mitigate adverse effects. And that is when we can actually suggest it to the crew members. We can give them a tested option, and they can actually evaluate whether our countermeasures are effective. That is how I think our work should be organized. So space, analog, and then space again.
Thank you, Ines. I think, a lot of really interesting points made there, and especially with respect to very carefully scoping what it is you're trying to get out of the analog that you're going to utilize for the solution or investigation of a certain type of problem or expedition, if you want to look at it on a broader scope. And I think it also points out that what we're doing is very complex. Even at the simplest, maybe that's not the right word, but more focused level of looking at one particular aspect of something, that's still a very complex thing to do from an analog standpoint. Lori.
Okay. I'm very happy to follow Anessa's talk, and we didn't even plan this in advance. But what I thought I would do is spend my 3 minutes giving a little bit more specific examples in the area of exercise countermeasures, because that's where my expertise is, and I have led both flight and bed rest studies of exercise programs. Mm-hmm. And what I have to say, I think, follows very nicely with what Anessa suggested as a big picture plan. But one way that one could implement this into their own area of research, and so my example will be exercise countermeasures, but you could pick your favorite countermeasure and put it in place, would be to look at what are the things we must know to go to Mars. So, for instance, exercise is a fairly mature countermeasure as our countermeasures go, and so people are fairly happy with their countermeasure system, whatever it may be, for 6 months. But the average crew member still comes back after 6 months with declines in cardiovascular, muscle, and bone. The declines are generally acceptable for 6 months. But what does that look like for 3 years? If that rate of decline continued for 3 years, that would not be so good. But we don't know what the time course of that is. And so this is a critical thing. This would be hard to study on ISS because there's a finite amount of time, a finite amount of missions, a volatile schedule of crew availability. So this might be a good area for analogs. So in this case, it would be the unloading type analogs. So it could be immersion or bed rest, depending on the details. And in this way, you could do a variety of things that you either can't do in flight or would be hard to do in flight, such as really carefully evaluate the time course of loss. Understand what would happen if you took breaks in your exercise program and you really lost a lot. Is there something you could do extra intense or extra long to recover? And understand how you could recuperate losses if there are losses below which you can't really recuperate. You could look at the performance of surface landing type tasks immediately after the bed rest. So you have fresh subjects who then you could evaluate under controlled conditions for whatever sorts of mission surface operations you might need to do. You could refine the requirements for the exercise hardware. How heavy of loads do we need? How fast does a treadmill need to go? To help inform the requirements for the next generation of exercise equipment, because the equipment we love on the ISS is very likely not going to Mars. The other thing I think it hasn't been mentioned is it could be a good arena to look at the individual differences. So in the exercise physiology world, not just in the space flight, but even in exercise physiology, individual differences are of great interest now. Different people do the same exercise program, and some improve a lot and some don't improve at all, and everything in between. The analogs would allow us a better way, I think, to understand those individual differences. Absolutely. Because the nutrition people will say it's because of your differing nutrition that some people did better or not, or it's because of your better or worse sleep, or your more or less stress, or your genetics, or there are so many factors, and we could control a lot of those major players in an analog setting so that everyone ate and slept, and we could at least take care of a lot of them to look then at more of the individual factors. We could also look at more autonomy. So by this I mean letting the crews or the bed rest or the analog participants, this has been mentioned before by some of the others, have more autonomy over controlling their own exercise, controlling their own rehab at the end of the whole thing, and understanding the motivation. So those are some of our key things in the exercise area that we still need to know that we don't know today that analogs might be quite useful for. There are two other areas that I wanted to briefly mention. One that we as a whole community have not done a whole lot of work on, and that is the isolation environments plus exercise as a stress relief, as a behavioral health, or even a contributor to the stress, and again, into the motivation and the team building and really looking at how exercise interplays in the isolated environment. And then the last one is the hardware reliability repairs and the autonomous care and feeding of the exercise hardware. So the exercise hardware on ISS requires quite a bit of support from the ground and crew maintenance and reliability. And so the ability to test new exercise devices in these austere environments to see how robust they are and how well the crew can fix them and how reliable and acceptable they are would be another prime area for analogs. And those wouldn't need to be the unloading analogs. They could really be any harsh environment.
Thanks, Lori. And thanks, because we know that a lot of the work that you guys have done has gone into the reason why the equipment we have on station right now is so effective. And when somebody can come back and be told they have statistically insignificant bone loss, I think that's a huge thing to have happening. Okay, Rachel.
Okay, so I know we're running behind, I promise. I just want to make two key points. My perspective on analogs comes from the fact that I'm currently directing two projects, one in flight and one in head down tilt bed rest, with identical measures to study changes in brain structure and function, sensory, motor, and cognitive behaviors. And one thing that I've learned that I think is really important relates to a comment that Jay made, but I'm going to take his comment and turn it around a little bit. So he was stressing the importance of really considering what is it that you want to study when you're picking your analog. And I will say, I think it is just as important to consider what you want to rule out when you are picking your analog. So this really resonates with what Inessa was saying. For example, with bed rest, we can mimic many aspects of flight. For example, the unloading, the fluid shifts with the head down tilt, but we're not affecting vestibular inputs. We still see some changes in vestibularly mediated behaviors when people come out of bed rest, but really this has to be occurring due to shifts in multisensory integration. It's not the same as what's happening in flight. And when you think about it in this way, and you have studies with identical measures in an analog and in a flight context, I really think it gives you very strong interpretation and explanatory power to be able to say what are the mechanisms that might be contributing to any changes that you see with flight. So I'm also really happy that some of our measures have been picked up by Matthias Basner for his winter over study. So I think, the more we can do with pooling of results across all of these studies with parallel measures, the more we will be able to really understand what is driving some of these changes in the flight environment when there are so many different things that are affecting the individual. So my second point I will make is relating back to this cooperative use of analogs. So when I came into my bed rest study, I will say I was a little bit naive about all of the other studies that were being run on the same participants. I initially was a bit concerned, thinking, what's going to happen? One of my subjects will have a painful muscle biopsy, and then someone will pop them into the scanner, and I won't be studying sensory motor control, I'll be studying pain. But I soon learned that our flight analogs team is incredibly organized and thoughtful and really manages the schedule. And in fact, I think we need to do more of this cooperation when you find yourself, even by accident, collecting data on the same subjects as someone else. So for example, and from different systems, yes. So any changes that I might see in the brain or sensory motor or cognitive behaviors, of course they're not happening in isolation, right? Vestibular system also exerts control on the cardiovascular system. Or if people are under stress in isolation, sleep loss, that's also going to affect the brain and sensory motor performance. There were people on the same campaign that were doing things like looking at how do fluid shifts affect smell and taste, and how is that going to affect enjoyment and intake of food. And in particular, Lori had a number of different exercise protocols that she was investigating in the same bed rest campaign. So we now are co-mentoring a postdoc who's looking at differential effects of exercise on the brain as well. So I think that these analog environments can be really productive springboards for cooperations and collaborations. So I'll close with that.
Thank you, Rachel. And I think that's a nice way to wrap it up. I think that first I want to thank all of you for participating on this panel. I think it was a nice kind of diverse mix of experience and perspective. And I think that it shows us, first of all, that the analogs that we've done have been effective, and that, like everything, we have room for improvement with them as well. But just in hearing the comments from all of you, there's resources out there, new facilities, there's prior experience, there's new studies underway that if we all, just kind of pool that together and take advantage of those things in a cooperative way, I think we'll gain much more from it than trying to go off individually with our own data collection or or facility development and that kind of thing. And I know that there's a lot of us that look forward to taking advantage of this in future space exploration as well. So as we're running late, I think we're not going to be in a position to open up for questions, but I thank you all for hanging around and for listening to what I thought was a very interesting conversation about analogs from every different standpoint.
Thank you, Nicole. We are now going to break up into 3 groups before you get your dinner, so if you want to eat dinner, you're going to have to work in the groups. So those who still have questions relative to analogs can probably go attend the analog group, which is going to meet in room 229 on the 2nd floor. And Graham Scott is going to be leading that discussion. And the education group will be meeting on the 3rd floor, in the 3rd floor conference room. And I think Carl and Barbara will lead that group. And then Group A will be meeting in this room, and Bill Gerstemeyer will be leading that group. So I think you all had indications of tentatively what we thought your interest would be. But there are 3 groups. One is going to be looking at cooperative analogs. The other is going to be looking at collaboration, which is in this room. And then the group on education is on the 3rd floor. We'll complete all that by 7 o'clock.